The Wild West defined a time and shaped a country. But the West never left.
It's much easier to think of history in terms of black and white, but ultimately the American West is far more different, far more diverse, far more interesting.
I'm Alaina Roberts. I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, and my work revolves around the West, like the intersection of Black and Native American life in North America.
The entwined experiences of Black and Native people in the Old West extends back hundreds of years, and key moments of this shared history happened right here in Oklahoma, formerly known as Indian Territory.
So I grew up going to Oklahoma. As a kid, I did what a lot of kids do. I just cared about playing with my friends and my cousins, so I didn't listen to kind of any of the amazing information that was being talked about by my elders. So it was really only later when I was in college that I thought more about who I was.
With a PhD under her belt, Dr. Roberts turned her analytical eye towards her own roots and discovered a story rarely told in the histories of the West.
It really began as an exploration of my family's history. So I wanted to understand how they were Black and mixed race people owned as slaves by Native Americans. That is, of course, not the usual story of North American slavery. And so I wanted to know how that was different and also how that really kind of intersected with Native American history. I realized that this history still has yet to really be examined in a full way, and a lot of Americans still don't know this history.
The beginnings of this complex story extends back hundreds of years before contact to the height of an ancient Native American society.
The 5 tribes are the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations, commonly referred to as the 5 tribes historically as well as today. And they are all of the kind of Muskogean language family, and they also are called Mississippian cultures. And so that means that they tie back to a place that is now in modern-day Illinois called Cahokia. Cahokia was a pre-Columbian city, had its heyday around 700 to 1100 AD. It was a huge metropolis, similar to London of its day, actually larger, more advanced. It had agriculture, it had plumbing, you had people of kind of various occupations.
The territory dominated by Cahokia expanded through the centuries. Much like every ancient civilization around the world, when native peoples went to war with one another, the victors often took members of the losing side captive. At Cahokia's height, it's estimated that over 20,000 people called this thriving metropolis home.
It was very important, I think, for me to always emphasize that, for example, in my classes, that there is this thriving, advanced civilization in North America before Europeans even find their way here.
But by 1350, Cahokia was mysteriously abandoned. The larger native society that had once ruled this land began to fragment into 5 smaller tribes: the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole nations. The earliest European colonists encountered members of these 5 tribes in the southeast. A relationship evolved as the people of the 5 tribes began to adopt European practices like Christianity, farming, and even chattel slavery. Though captives had historically been taken in war, adopting racial hierarchies and owning Black people was seen as civilized assimilation by European colonists of the period. Those people of African descent who were enslaved by some members of the 5 tribes spoke tribal languages, cooked and ate Native American food, reproduced with their Native American masters. By any cultural metric, those that were enslaved were just as much Native American as those who owned them. Despite alliances with early colonists, the southeastern homelands of the five tribes would not remain safe from the reach of the U.S. government.
Even though they all have treaties that say that they are going to stay in their spaces, that they are sovereign nations with rights, the federal government, eventually with President Andrew Jackson at its head, decides that they're going to move these five tribes.
With the passage of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, thousands of Native people and their slaves were forced from the southeast on a long march west.
Black people who were enslaved by Native Americans experienced the Trail of Tears, that kind of removal from their own homelands as well as the five tribes.
After months of hardship, they finally arrived in the swath of land designated Indian Territory, located in present-day Oklahoma.
Today we're at Fort Gibson, built in 1824 to protect the Cherokee Creek and Seminole people who were forced to live here after Indian removal.
Ultimately, 20 to 30 tribes share this small corner of Oklahoma.
Well, Fort Gibson is a reminder that some of the first people to settle in western spaces were Native Americans. And so because white settlers forced people out of their southeastern homelands, they're forced here to really kind of impede on the lands and settlements of other Native people who already lived in the West, like the Comanches and the Osage. Unlike most military posts and forts throughout the West, Fort Gibson is built to protect Native American settlers rather than white settlers.
Living in Indian Territory is not easy for the five tribes, or for those they considered their property. By 1861, 8,000 to 10,000 enslaved black people were living throughout Indian Territory. As it was in the South, slaves experienced a spectrum of treatment. Some Native owners allowed them autonomy, while others enacted cruel and violent punishments and harsh restrictions. As Southern states seceded, the Confederacy approached the five tribes to form alliances, and some tribal members decided to fight with the South and keep their slaves.
Josie Jackson is my great-great-grandmother, and she was a woman of mixed-race ancestry, so she is black, white, and Chickasaw. And she is kind of representative of this interesting emancipation that happens in Indian Territory. So she is not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation nor the 13th Amendment, because she is in the Chickasaw Nation, which is a sovereign Indian nation.
Ultimately, the Confederacy and their allies from the five tribes lose to the United States. Freedom finally comes for Josie and the others.
And so it's the treaties of 1866 that end the Civil War amongst the five tribes that also emancipate her. That same treaty also gives her a land allotment.
People formerly enslaved by the five tribes become known as freedmen. Post-Civil War treaties command that five tribes grant the freedmen tribal citizenship, as well as their own piece of land.
And in those treaties was land cession, so the cession of hundreds of thousands of acres of land that they had just moved on to about 30 years earlier. And that really was kind of the main purpose of these treaties. But also within those treaties was the emancipation of my family members and others like them, their enfranchisement, so their citizenship in those tribes, and also land allotments. I think we can see this as a form of reparations, a form that no one else of African descent received in the world, really, as payment for that enslavement. And so that allows free men to create communities, have land ownership, have their own farms. Once I really started researching my family history and decided that I wanted to be a historian, going back to Oklahoma held so much more kind of importance, because I realized how kind of amazing it was that my family had land. Like, we are a black family. Most African Americans cannot trace their family history back as far as I can, and they don't have land. And that land is now 4 or 5 generations old and still in my family. But the more I did my research and wrote my book, I really realized what it meant that my family had this land, and meaning it was taken from Native people first. They're Native American slave owners. And so all of the complications that are part of that, Native American slaveholding, emancipation, black land ownership, I think is indicative of all that we don't learn about the American West.
After years of digging through archives and collecting histories and family stories, Dr. Roberts was finally able to weave together this complex story in her book, which shows in full force that the hidden history of her people has been there all the while.
My book is called I've Been Here All the While, Black Freedom on Native Land, and it really began as an exploration of my family's history. What does it mean that they are Black and mixed race people enslaved by Native Americans? And so looking at that, but then looking at what that means that slavery is a part of Indian removal, what that means that Native Americans are part of the Civil War and the Reconstruction period, but really looking at all of these different Black, Native, and white stories really gives us an idea of how important land was in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and also how that really intersected with Native American history.
Much of the story of the freedmen and their descendants has been lost to time, and the importance of the shared experiences between them and the members of the 5 tribes, with whom their histories are intimately entwined, has become divided as disputes escalate over territory and recognition.
Chickasaw Nation did not give citizenship to my family members, but the other 4 nations did do that for their former slaves. And so for decades, those former slaves had, important positions in their communities socially. And so Black people were an important part of these Native American nations going into the 60s and 70s. But in the 1970s and 80s, as Native American nations got back more of their autonomy from the federal government, started investing in themselves and their communities, they disenrolled all of these former slaves. And so they no longer recognize the citizenship of these people who are called freedmen. And so people like my family, we can't enroll in the Choctaw Nation or in the Chickasaw Nation because we are not recognized as historical members of those communities, even though we were an important part of those societies.
Many descendants of the freedmen, like Dr. Roberts, continue the decades-old fight to have their tribal membership recognized, while also acknowledging that there are shared experiences of oppression which both peoples endured throughout the centuries. Dr. Roberts hopes that by bringing these complex stories to light, there can finally be recognition and reconciliation amongst the people.